now.
Kaushik, can you guys see the right screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Timo, is there a go? Should we get started?
Yes, let's start now.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everybody. This is Sana Tariq. I'm the Principal Technology Architect in TELUS, and I'm working as a SIG Architecture Chair. Today, this presentation on Beyond R1 and giving you an update on the roadmap. Myself and Kaushik will walk you through our thinking process, what we are thinking about, the current work and evolution in the community, and how we are driving the community to move forward in the various streams. We'll give you a recap of what has happened so far and what we are thinking for Beyond R1 activities. So let's dive into it. We'll give you a quick recap on where we started and why it's important for us to consider the North Star, so that as we are developing our focused on R1 and Beyond R1, how can we consider the reasons why Nephio was born and why it's so important for us to consider the elements that were actually missing in the industry. So as we started the virtualization journey, we actually started with the virtual network functions, and we had a lift and shift philosophy for a lot of telco network function software, which was transformed into a virtual network function. So the initial developments around VNFs and how it was ported to cloud was not very cloud native, it wasn't agile. And we had faced a lot of operational inefficiencies and problems with agility. Gradually, the industry shifted towards container-based networks, and we started forming CNFs. And as we consider the deployment and operationalizing of CNFs, we again presented a significant amount of complexity in our onboarding processes, in our management of CNFs. And the industry has evolved significantly around that, how Etsy has done a significant amount of work there. And the brownfield of CNF deployment has grown enormously. Nonetheless, the industry got together and we realized that there is still a need for us to optimize and improve the agility in the process of how we are deploying CNFs and how we are managing CNFs to the cloud at scale. And we were looking for some faster, simpler, easier automation approach, and Nephio's principles were actually introduced, which received a lot of momentum because many service providers were actually experiencing similar challenges. Now, the interesting ideas around Nephio as we are looking into the community are that many service providers are actually pulling in their ideas on their experience of what they have been working on so far and how their journey on deploying CNFs to the cloud is giving them a different kind of challenge and where these challenges are coming from. And we as in community members are trying to identify what should be the roadmap for Nephio in the coming years that can actually address incrementally the problems that we are facing today so that that can be solved and the industry can actually find a more agile and cloud native way of deploying network functions and managing network services onto the cloud. So another quick recap on the challenges that we have been experiencing. Where the Kubernetes came from. Kubernetes came from the IT world where the web scale applications were simple and there were only basic networking compute requirements for those applications to run on the cloud. But with the extra customizations and the complexity required for telco network functions, where we had all the extra pod extensions like SRIUV, DPDK, CPU pinning, huge pages, these additional resources were not natively defined in Kubernetes at the time when we started working on deploying Kubernetes to the cloud. And those additional resources were handled as a part of extra resources from the application itself. So the idea of VNF managers was born in the industry, where VNF manager would have the scope and visibility to the deployed network function with all its microservices, plus the additional resources which are actually handled as one application. And the idea of VNF managers continued to grow. And if you look at the paradigm of how different network functions were actually evolving, a lot of vendors were trying to offer solutions, and in every vendor solution, there would be a new VNF manager, which would address the problem of deploying your network function to the cloud. if you look at one example of one application and one vendor situation, it does seem like they did a good job to help you deploy the network function with a fully templatized environment and help you manage the configurations and help you manage the life cycle. But if you look at the whole paradigm from an ecosystem, from a service provider's lens, it actually added a lot of complexity in how we are managing a large number of tools, each responsible for a significant function, and that model of deploying network functions to the cloud was not simpler to scale. That's one of the problems. And the second big problem that I could see from this solution, how we approached deploying network functions to the cloud at that stage, was the adoption of Helm charts. That was available a couple of years ago as the most mature templating model in the Kubernetes community, and that was drastically adopted because it was simpler to implement at that stage. But as we have more complex network functions and we have large number of microservices to be represented on the cloud, we generally have extremely large values files that the templates become very complex and they're very difficult to read and write. Sometimes reusing and resetting the values files from going for site-to-site deployment also becomes very challenging. And the documentation on those values files and sometimes the documentation around your process of onboarding isn't fully mature or fully available, or the APIs are sometimes missing. So that's really the current state of how we are deploying our network functions to the cloud. And it's an industry problem, and the industry has to come together in our ability to be able to solve these problems through a holistic approach, which can actually help us unify the tools and which can actually help us drive more agility and optimization on how we are taking our applications to the cloud. I'm presenting one more diagram that can actually walk us through in a little bit more detail on what I mean by the unification of tools and why this is significantly important in a service provider's environment. So if you look at the left-hand side of this particular diagram, I'm representing how the CNF deployment would currently take place in a service provider's environment. The very left-hand side is the gray line that indicates how we perform infrastructure as code. A lot of success and a lot of progress has been made on the ability to perform fully automated infrastructure through maybe a lot of CI/CD pipelines. And within our organization, we have seen a lot of momentum on that effort as well, which is great. But there are certain process level gaps and there are certain technology level gaps that we need to still address and unify around. So generally, the gray line is a precursor to deploying a network function. And the way the information is coming from a vendor or the application owners sometimes is an out-of-band exercise to the rest of network function deployment exercise. And there are generally 4 stages of infrastructure development, including onboarding, your deployment of the Kubernetes, and then configuration of the Kubernetes. The idea of Nephio is actually tying and trying to unify the configuration of the Kubernetes and the deployment of network function as one entity, because a flat basic Kubernetes environment can host a large number of network functions. But if you have a specific network function, for example, a UPF or a complex 5G network, which would require the number of CRDs and number of certain configurations that has to go on the clusters for preparation of an onboarding of a Helm chart that is coming from a UPF, that cluster configuration is also a part of scope for the Nephio, which actually makes a lot of sense, because if you try to make these activities in sync and synchronized through one exercise, it actually brings a lot of process optimizations within the organization as well. I'm going to just make a note on the transition on the right-hand side in a minute. I need to walk you through the next process step, which is the deployment of the network function. As the deployment of the network function itself is automated to a large level. But if you see the current state that we have large number of VNF managers and every VNF manager hosts the templates, which is basically the execution of the Helm charts. And they are probably using the same type of Helm charts and same OCP APIs, which are running on Kubernetes. But there are still a lot of customizations required for each different type of network function that we have to maintain that number of VNF managers hosted in an environment, although they're all doing a very similar function. But it's sometimes not possible for us to have a generic VNF manager, which has been an industry dream for some time, but the realization of that is sometimes difficult to achieve. The other problem is that when you deploy the network function, it's not a fire and forget situation. You are looking at a network function that has to live on the cloud, and then that has to realize real-time QoS requirements for very discrete telecom services, which means that the lifecycle management of those network functions, the healing, scaling, and growing and shrinking is also extremely significant. And as an industry, I know that we have made least amount of progress on the policy control side. And I can see why that problem is there. Some of the process level transformations that are happening in the organizations around change management and how the automated closed loop can actually drive a lot of these changes for us today as a technology maturity wise. But at the same time, the transformational challenges are existing throughout the telecom industry, which is one barrier. But the other big barrier that I would personally see is that today, it's a lot of disaggregation and fragmentation in how we approach to implement the policy. For example, these different EMSs or these analytic systems that are coming from large number of network functions, each presents a different schema, each presents a different interface. So you build your plugins and your adapters to all these different types of management systems, and you retrieve that data. And sometimes you're able to develop a policy in one language locally in one VNF manager, or sometimes in the other VNF manager, or maybe sometimes in the service orchestrator. And you're probably using different types of tools and languages for that. This model represents a very large complexity in terms of managing your day 2 plus of operational aspect of your CNF as it runs on the cloud. Transforming to basically the right-hand side of this picture, which is the presentation of the Nephio. For all these fragmentation, we can replace that with one Kubernetes-based templating model. We can use 3 pools of CRDs and operators for infrastructure, one for deploying the network function, one for the management of network function, which is actually a possibility if we adopt the model, and as the model matures and grows, that the industry could actually rely on one Kubernetes model and actually relieve the heterogeneity and the complexity in which each network function is actually handled as a pet. The second important element that I wanted to emphasize is the infinite control loop. As you develop your operators for these distinct streams, an operator can run in an infinite loop. An operator or maybe operators can run in an infinite loop, which can actually manage your day 2 plus all in one unified tool and a unified approach with a unified model. The unification of tools is something that the industry is badly looking for right now, and it's actually helping. It's going to help us drive a lot of vendor neutrality, a lot of openness in this world, with a lot of clear documentation and common use of APIs. We can find a common denominator across this industry with many public and private cloud providers, all offering Kubernetes-based deployments. And the simplest model of deploying these network functions to the cloud can actually help us achieve the agility goal that we are looking for within the Nephio community. This is just trying to reiterate on the infinite closed loop that I just mentioned. The control loop of Nephio is one of the most powerful and most promising aspects. And as we try to build our long-term roadmap within the community, we are trying to remember that this was a North Star. And as we are moving into the various working groups, which Kaushik will walk you through, and as we have a large number of developments upcoming, something that we have to stick to is the ability to be able to come back to our North Star, which was the ability to help deployment of the network function, making it faster, easier, simpler, as well as the control loop to become manageable and scalable as we drive into the era of hybrid cloud, and as we are moving more towards the 5G and O-RAN deployment of network functions. The incremental approach to achieving a very cloud native deployment is something that I tried to capture in this slide. Which is showing that the transition to Nephio model is definitely not going to happen overnight. There will be an incremental series of steps that we need to take as an industry together, and how we are driving the work with our organizations and vendors is actually going to create a laddered approach for us to be able to reach the stage which is very cloud native and a Nephio based model. So today we are in the current stage. We are working with a large number of VNF managers and EMSs, and we are using a lot of customized templates with our existing deployments. As we transition to a more cloud-native approach, maybe using still Helm charts, which is existing in the brownfield, a large number of effort has to happen on transitioning these Helm charts to the operators and CRDs. We could still use the Helm charts, but we can start to rely more on the OCP native APIs, and we can try to come up with a model in which we are using a generic VNF manager somehow. That transformation itself is going to make us a little more cloud native, as we would understand the ability of how we're deploying the Helm charts and how we're managing the CSR packages and how we're deploying these network functions to cloud, all in one model. Moving away from the pets to the kettle approach is our step towards becoming more cloud native in how we are achieving our automation. Gradually, we might feel that we are in a hybrid stage where we have some network functions still being deployed as a Helm chart, and some network functions are actually using now operators and CRDs for deployment and lifecycle management. Gradually, we would transition to a stage where the industry would evolve to the point that most of the Helm charts and all the Helm charts could actually be translated into operators and CRDs, and we would reach a stage where the lifecycle management of all these functions can actually happen through the Kubernetes native constructs. And that would be a stage where we can actually deploy these applications at scale and we can manage these applications at scale. And this is a vision that I have been working on within my organization as well. And with that vision, our vendors and our partners were actually responsible for giving us the high quality 5G and beyond supported applications, and the kind of performance that those applications give is something that has to thrive and that has to grow with us as an industry. But the wrapping of those applications and how those applications are delivered to us and how those applications go to the cloud is something that needs drastic attention at the moment, and how we can optimize those models and how we can improve on those models and how we can be more agile as an industry is something that we all need to work together on and we need to focus on. A very quick recap on why we think that within the Nephio model, and operators and CRDs was something that was a basic principle of why we wanted to adopt that. Helm and operators are both supported by Kubernetes community, and operators were recent, and operators were just considered super powerful in doing certain things better than how Helm would handle that. So the way these initial templates were introduced in the Kubernetes communities, Helm was used for a fire and forget model. If you need an application that you need to deploy once and then forget it, Helm is the ideal situation for you. You just use Helm charts and you use values files to be able to perform site-to-site deployments with that. It was simpler to adopt, industry adopted that, and we have a large number of Helm-based deployments happening today, which is completely fine, as it's the incremental evolution to doing things better over time, and technology evolves every few years. Operators, on the other hand, was not introduced in the telco world before because they were mostly used for infrastructure configurations, and they were still in the industry. But with the Nephio project, the idea was to consider using operators for the network functions deployment, which made a great sense to a lot of people who are actually in the Nephio community at that stage, because it felt like this is an opportunity for us to manage the day 2+ of our applications through the Kubernetes APIs. And there's an ability for us to manage holistically all the application resources within the Kubernetes layer, basically extending the Kubernetes layer to a stage where it becomes a telco generic VNF manager that is capable of managing deployment and lifecycle of your entire CNF. And similarly, the ideas around Nephio are also evolving around configuration as data and Kubernetes resource model, making it more intent-driven and making it simpler to deploy for a large number of deployments. The goal is to reduce complexity and to bring the intent-based declarative approach in how we are moving into various iterations of our roadmap. And of course, a large number of our roadmap efforts are also going to be focused on how do we make this simpler for the community? How do we make the transition from Helm to operators simpler? Because the significant amount of investment and effort happened in the Helm is not going to go away overnight. But then if the community comes up with ideas and and SDKs that actually help support transitioning some of these templates to the other model, could actually help us accomplish some of the incremental steps towards moving to the more agile cloud-native state of deployments. A large number of people generally ask us a question to basically scope Nephio, and I know that within this within this conference, there are other forums and sessions that are also trying to address the problem. But here's one of the slides that was actually presented multiple times before, and it's also on the Nephio website, which gives us some understanding on the scope of the Nephio, how Nephio can actually interact with the end-to-end service orchestration there. To me, the beginning stage of the Nephio is going to work on the domain orchestration, where we are deploying our network functions, the infrastructure configuration, and the lifecycle management of the network functions. Now, some network functions are closely stitched with the other network functions. For example, if you consider the 5G network, the 5G network can actually be taken holistically, defining the relationship, and sometimes the UPF, SMF, AMF relationship can also be expressed within the Nephio. So the scope of Nephio is deploying a single network function or the service, and then interacting with the correct APIs with its end-to-end service orchestration to perform the rest of the PNF and transport configurations that are required to stitch the service end-to-end. And the initial scope of Nephio is still being considered and still evolving. It's something that the community is working together to create documentations, and myself and Kaushik has done a significant amount of work with the community over the last couple of weeks to gather feedback and to be able to understand what the other service providers and other community members need, and in terms of the scope and how we need to continue working forward. But the initial scope and initial design has been laid out in the website, and this is the document that I took directly from the Nephio artifacts on the website. Currently, the collaboration that is happening between the SIG architecture group is throughout our organizational bodies. We are gradually getting to the stage where we are forming working groups and we are going to work with the standards. These telcos are currently participating, and there are many more which are actually represented in the community, and they are working actively with us to define requirements, to define the long-term roadmap vision, to define the short-term roadmap vision. We need to get more cloud providers in the community to start participating, as we would like Nephio to become the Kubernetes standard across the industry. Currently, Red Hat is very prominent in terms of the work they're doing, and they're represented in the community. A lot of network function vendors are also contributing and working. And the important part that I want to convey in the slide is that this whole concept can actually come together when all these entities can collaboratively work together. And one of the efforts that myself and Kaushik are actually taking right now is to bring these communities together under various working groups so that these streams can run in parallel. I will now invite Kaushik to come in and walk you through the next half of the presentation, and then hopefully we'll take some questions at the end. Kaushik,
Perfect.
you want to take over? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sana, for the laying out the backdrop that led to the inception and evolution of Nephio. So we'll spend some time looking at the first release of Nephio, which is around the corner. We'll talk about the user stories and how that lays the groundwork for what is shaping up beyond the release one. So when we started the release one, the community was kind of somewhat forming. We were all trying to figure out the key problems. As you heard from Sana, the problem space is fairly broad, from everything from telcos, operational, technical, business, cultural challenges, and so forth. So one of the ways that we thought we will be able to zero in is, first, let's pick up a network function that is easy to use. We shouldn't be constrained by legalities, licensing, and so forth. So we picked up free 5GC, and we looked at specifically using the Nephio principles that you just heard talk about. Can we deploy this free 5GC, in this case, UPF and SMF, in a way that allows us to demonstrate both day one and day two scenarios? So what we mean by that is, user story one, we are deploying a free 5GC, UPF and SMF in a 5G core like deployment. There's an NF topology, CR, that has been specified that allows, specifying, let's say you need 3 UPFs and an AMF, and these are the N3, N6, N4 interfaces for the UPF. They connect to SMF and AMF and so forth, right? So that's the first user story, which is a day one scenario. But then, as you can understand, day two scenarios are extremely common in a telco. So how do we scale both horizontal and vertical scaling of these, these couple NFs that we had in scope? So being able to upgrade, let's say, the CPU of existing UPF set of microservices running on a Kubernetes cluster, or having to deploy a new UPF, and the same applies to let's say an SMF. So think of these as basic fundamental building blocks which allow us to stitch the Kubernetes KRM-based CRs across all the layers of the telco stack, right from the cloud infrastructure to NF deployment to NF configuration, and demonstrates with a real network function what would be the day one and day two scenarios look like. Caveating it with the fact that this is early stage development, this is not meant to be production grade and so forth, but the goal was to really prove to ourselves, to the community as well as to the larger audience that, hey, the principles that we all agreed to were the key, formative aspects of Nephio, we should be able to realize those. And I would say that we are still a few days away, but the work that the team has put together, the community, has been fantastic. There have been many collaborations from many different organizations working cohesively to drive this. And sooner than later, you'll be able to see a working demo of what these user stories look like. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so somewhat kind of describing the community participation. So we started off with the design principles and goals, and I believe there's a slide following this. We'll talk about that in a little bit detail. So we presented that late last year, around end of Q3. And then one of the other things that we did was a fair bit of telcos had been actively participating in SIG-1. So we requested both the, as well as the vendors, of course. So we requested both the telcos and the vendors to produce requirements from their lens of what are the challenges. You heard Sana talk about from the telco lens of what the challenges are. Vendors have a slightly different way, but equally important way to look at challenges. So we took all of those requirements. There were about 8 to 10 companies that produced those requirements. We looked at the lowest common denominator of those, what those requirements are, and that is what led to the formation of the urban stories that I just talked about in the previous slide. So this was all a very nice flow where we looked at the requirements, we looked at the lowest common denominator, we looked at then what is the minimum viable scope of release one that we should be targeting in line with the timelines that we wanted to target, which was sometime mid of 23. Next slide, please. Perfect. So this is probably somewhat iterating what you heard from Sana say, but let's go through it regardless. So in terms of design principles, the first and foremost is KRM, which is Kubernetes Resource Model, and configuration is data-based, consistent and common automation framework with vendor extensibility for lifecycle management of infrastructure, network functions, and network function configuration. And this is a very important aspect because that consistency across all the layers of a telco stack, lowest bottommost layer of cloud infra to the topmost layers of network function, today is not consistent. And you heard Sana talk about the fragmentation of tools. There are more fragmentation dimensions. There is fragmentation of infrastructure as the cloud. There is fragmentation of the network functions themselves, and there's fragmentation of the automation tools. So a lot of the Nephio work is not just addressing the fragmentation of the automation tools, but also helping address how do we unify across a suite of infrastructures a common set of configuration parameters, which will be the CRs for infrastructure provisioning, which would then be applicable to be used for all different kinds of clouds, including private clouds, including public clouds. And I think that's the strength and beauty of using Kubernetes principles. So that's first. The second is inter-network function and NF to infrastructure dependency management to be able to specify and enforce dependencies. This is yet another key aspect, which is today, when you look at a telco provisioning a cloud infrastructure for resources on the cluster, for example, needed by a network function, it happens disjoint, which means you first provision SRIV DPDK in a very disjoint way based on some out of band planning that happens through a set of different sets of tools. Then a different team potentially uses EVNFM to deploy, let's say, the network functions on that provision cloud infrastructure using in a completely disparate set of processes and tools. And then you then have a separate system like EMS that does it. There hasn't been, so that's one aspect. The other thing is there isn't, because you're using different disparate set of tools, there isn't a good way to specify dependencies in a consistent and a well understood way that is vendor agnostic network function agnostic, and cloud infrastructure provider agnostic. So being able to model these as data schemas that can span across these vendors, network function types, and so forth is extremely important. And the third bullet is distributed actuation and reconciliation of the intent. So Kubernetes control plane is continuous infinite reconciliation. That's the core principle. But then what we do here is leveraging that, we do orchestration as a distributed outcome. So today, for example, a lot of the automation tools have a centralized orchestration. So if you have a span of, let's say, 100,000 clusters where you're deploying cell sites, your orchestration is still, centralized. What Nephio through Kubernetes does is, yes, there could be a centralized hierarchy, but then you distribute the orchestration of, let's say, realizing an intent down to the unit of workload cluster, which could be on the edge for running a CU/DU. It could be centralized a little bit for a core network and so forth. So this hierarchy and this ability to do the actuation in a distributed way is extremely powerful because it allows you to inherently scale the infrastructure without having a very tight dependency between the scalability of your automation versus scalability of your cloud infrastructure and the network functions itself. And lastly, the user friendliness of deployment. As you can understand, it is much easier for a user of automation system to have to just specify intent, which would be very simple as deploy a UPF in this region with this much capacity, versus having to specify a very complex Helm chart with a very complicated, logic and values.yaml file, which is very hard to populate and so forth. So I think it is extremely important from a user experience standpoint that we approach and adopt a CAD and declarative style of modeling configuration. In terms of design goals, layering from these principles, the goal is we want to define this common set of CRDs, the Kubernetes CRs, for infrastructure NF deployment, but at the same time realizing that every vendor has their own ways of provisioning these, and we want to retain those extensions. But by and large, as much as possible, there is a fair bit of infrastructure and NF deployment lowest common denominator that we expect to, we expect to be vendor agnostic and potentially even network function agnostic. So all of those, that has been the work that is also happening through R1. Second part, defining interfaces and pluggability for operators that operate on the Nephio CRs. As you can imagine, every organization has its own way of doing things like CI/CD, release management, deployment logic, and so forth. And each one has a different choice while meeting these design principles. So how do we ensure the interfaces are such that different organizations within the Nephio construct can do it in a pluggable way? This is not yet fully figured out, but this is one of the design goals as we are working towards evolving the architecture beyond release one. And lastly, define an end-to-end automation framework for infrastructure automation in a declarative manner. This is exactly deriving from the design principles. Next slide, please. So this is a dense slide in the sense you'll see a few bullets. Each of these bullets has got a lot of material behind it. I'll try my best to concisely cover this, and we'll use the last 10-15 minutes for Q&As where we can go deeper. So in terms of user stories, the first and foremost, multi-cloud. And I kind of hinted about it when I talked about the variability of the kind of infrastructure, cloud infrastructure that a telco deploys. You've got private clouds. You've seen adoption of public clouds with cloud native. You also see vendor specific container as a service on custom hardware and so forth, right? How do we unify through a common set of infrastructure CRs to be able to support in a Nephio compliant way? So that's one of the first and foremost goals. Second, multi-vendor network functions. We started with free 5GC for the reasons I described, but more and more we want to, through the participation of vendors in the Nephio community, we are encouraging them to extend their network functions to be supported through Nephio automation. So you'll see more and more of multi-vendor network function support coming up beyond R1. Third is multi-domain. I kind of didn't talk explicitly, but as you could see from the thematic of the release one user stories, we started with core networks. That was one of the easiest things that we could start with. But then we expect the automation, this to be a multi-domain orchestration. So how do we look at radio networks, wireline, transport, potentially even look at SD-WAN and so forth, right? So all of these domains, there is a fair bit of interest coming from the community participants in helping shape up some of the work. And each of these domains have many unique capabilities. For example, when you look at RAN, there was a previous talk about ORAN and Nephio. So there's a fair bit of work that we expect to do when it comes to within the RAN domain between ORAN and Nephio, defining declarative, O2 APIs, for example. And similarly, within transport, there has been a fair bit of thinking around existing SD-WAN standards and how we'll be able to extend those through Nephio declarative APIs. The fourth bullet is day zero. So the user stories that you saw in R1 were more day one and two. But like Sana talked about, the expectation is right from a network designer to a network operations. We want Nephio to solve their problems and their user stories. So you will see a day zero focus would be things like, I want to design my network as a telco network designer. What are the key kinds of requirements that I want Nephio to be solving in a very declarative way? So you'll see those kinds of requirements and user stories being starting to get addressed beyond R1. Lastly, this is something that we are still forming the ideas, but then beyond domain orchestration as a subsystem, could there be other things that we could be doing as Nephio? So for example, there has been discussions about mini service orchestration, which is today service orchestration does slice management for 5G. And it does it in a very particular way, especially most of the implementations today are HCMANO compliant with SOL interface compliance and so forth. Uh, if you want to do this in a truly cloud native way, what would that outlook look like? And so higher level constructs beyond what the immediate focus is equally important, because in the end, to realize the true business outcome and the overall value prop of Nephio through Kubernetes, just scoping it to one layer may not be sufficient. We'll need to look at the higher layers as well. And lastly, scalability. Like I was mentioning, the release one is somewhat more functional in scope. We are putting things together so that they work well. But when given our common desire to look at production, building production grade infrastructure automation through Nephio, how do we build for scalability? What do the scalability requirements of telcos look like, and so forth? So there is a fair bit of requirements gathering on all of these dimensions: functional, operational, scale, performance that is happening. And we are going through the motion of figuring out what are these common themes across telcos and also across vendors, cloud and NF vendors, and how do these these user stories along all these dimensions, how do we prioritize and drive for the outcome beyond release one? The second area is CRDs and operators. In that, the first thing, like I said, Kubernetes is great when it comes to a basic cloud infrastructure for web applications, IT workloads. But when it comes to telcos, the kind of data models that are being expected, which is being able to say, how do I define a data model that allows me to specify a network topology? How do I define a data model that allows me to specify what my database microservice requirements are on cert validation and on VPN connection to a centralized automation system? None of these capabilities are intrinsic to Kubernetes, but then these are thematically fairly common across all the telcos. All the telcos need to deploy network functions, have the stitching of the network functions to create core network, radio network. So these are very common themes. So how do we create these data models in a very telco-centric way using Kubernetes principles? So that's point number one. Operator SDK. This is a somewhat loosely defined term, but think about operationally, assuming all of this functionality is available. Not every vendor is cloud native today for a set of reasons. And we cannot expect everyone to be cloud native in the immediate scheme of things. So it will be a journey depending on who the vendor is and depending on who the customer is. We expect them to go through this journey from where they are to getting to the true cloud native. How do we enable these vendors to adapt to Nephio through an SDK which solves two things. If they today are using Helm, Tosca, and so forth, what would be a brownfield support for Helm and Tosca look like from an Nephio? This is one of the key open questions. And Helm can mean many things to many people. Helm can mean package management. Helm, which you could use Helm as a package manager in that scenario to package CRDs and operators. You could use Helm in a more traditional way, which is you define infrastructure as code and you have values to YAML, and that is not exactly what we want to do. But then regardless, there is a fair bit of work to figure out how do we support some of the brownfield technologies in order to meet the business goals of the telcos in a more expeditious way without expecting a step function change 0 to 1. And same thing with Helm and Yang Tosca support. A lot of this work will help enable easy onboarding of a vendor that may not be yet ready to build cloud native operators, Kubernetes operators. And then lastly, on the CRDs, a lot of this work will not be as useful unless there is a way to enforce compliance and certification. As we look at, let's say, production grade scalability of Nephio and many different network function vendors for their network functions, they have new versions that they're rolling out. How do telcos know they are compliant to Nephio? So this is one of the key themes of compliance and certification program that we plan to focus on. And then on the control plane domain, we are looking at UI as part of simplification of the user experience. We started with very basic things for the release one, but there is ongoing work to look at what would be these northbound APIs, southbound APIs of Nephio, and what will that user experience look like for day 0, 1, 2. And somewhat deriving from that, there'll be design studios, which we expect makes it easy to configure the UI in a way that a telco or a network function vendor would want to. And then I think I talked about the northbound APIs. Today, Nephio is somewhat built as a more disjoint model. But then as we look at deploying this in a real production grade, what are the interactions with and user journeys, integrations with service orchestration, with inventory systems, with OSS, rest of the OSS BSS systems. These are all important ways to ensure that we have a holistic understanding of how Nephio, in whatever shape and form factor as it evolves, fits into the rest of the telco automation subsystem. I will. There are a couple things I will state here.
Hey, Kaushik, it's Heather. Do you mind if I ask a quick question? I know you sort of
Yes,
said
please.
hold questions to the end, but this one I think just really sort of pinged me, which is, you're talking about the, sort of Helm support and sort of a lot of applications out there. There are reasons that Helm support, is widely supported and adopted. And there's a reason that for the telecom domain, we have chosen to move away from that. And I'm not questioning either those reasons or those choices. But if as a telecom industry and ecosystem, we want to have access to a large number of applications, to what extent does it require work from the application developer, to support this technology stack, as opposed to, let's say, the basic Helm, sort of way of working, versus how much can they be mostly out of the box with one or two nuances, and it's handled by, a Nephio layer or an ONAP or, other things that are specifically being built and designed for telecom itself. Does that question make sense?
It does. Maybe
Rambling
just
question.
No, that's a great question. When you say application developers, are you looking at network function vendors, or are you looking at higher level
I
applications
think
that
it's
exist?
a combination of network functions. And look, let's be honest, for highly telecom specific network functions like a UPF, like everything that comes with free 5GC, those are applications that are only designed for, telecom networking. But as you start to look into more sort of maybe networking centric applications that could live in both maybe a networking centric enterprise environment and a telecom, like to what extent? So let's say something around network sensitive edge applications or network sensitive data applications or big data applications or AI. I'm sorry, now I'm just throwing around acronyms, but stuff that might not be telecom centric, but one could still view as networking aware or networking intense, but not necessarily designed to be part of a telecom network, right? Like, to what extent do they have to rewrite, rethink, or do work?
Yeah, so two things, and maybe Sana, you should chime in, right? One,
Yeah.
whatever key principles and building blocks technology-wise we are building are not always telco specific, not necessarily
Yeah.
telco specific.
I figured
right? Like, for
they
example,
weren't, so that's what I was trying to draw out a little bit. Yeah.
right. But the second thing is, at the same time, we are somewhat, focused to ensure that the key problems of the complexities of network functions, the dependencies or infrastructure, a way to consistently model these dependencies through data models and schemas, we need to solve it in a telco specific way. And the network functions today are the most complex,
Yeah.
set of applications where we need to focus because that drives the biggest value for the telcos. At the same time, there has been some thinking looking at OSS, BSS, IT workloads that a telco runs. They also, a lot of those workloads run in a public cloud, which typically has richer sets of tools, but there's still automation, gaps that exist. So we will at some point evaluate how do we extend the technology to also solve for these other applications. But there isn't yet, when you talked about, edge applications like retail edge and other such things, I think we should be a little bit more nuanced in ensuring that we don't go
Mhm.
too wide at the same
Yeah.
time without really proving the value in a domain that is of most importance to the telcos. So I would personally, think that we need to really prove the value for an area that telcos care about, which to me is the network functions to start with. And then we should then work with the community and potentially other such communities in open source to figure out how we can extend what we have built to help benefit those industries.
Yeah. No, and that's reasonable. And I'm sorry, Sana, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to basically top up. If I have understood your question correctly, Heather, and the way I understood your question, I would like to contribute to what Kaushik tried to explain to you. Why do we, so where is Nephio coming from is basically I want to go back to. Kubernetes was great, right? Kubernetes was already doing the magic in the industry. All the web scale applications can already be described with the Kubernetes patterns and constructs. They don't need anything specific. So a lot of the acronyms that you threw for the AI and ML and all the edge applications, as long as they are natively expressible in Kubernetes, we are fine. The magic is already there. Kubernetes has done wonders in the world. Where the problem is coming from? The problem is coming where we have more complex applications like 5G applications requiring a lot of new constructs on the cloud, the customizations, SRIOV, DPDK, CPU pages, and all these extra things. These extra things were not natively visible in the Kubernetes layer. Kubernetes is an orchestrator. Now that orchestrator has no visibility into these additional newly defined resources on the cloud. And that's the problem. And that problem is actually getting addressed by defining CRDs and then writing operators for that. So basically, the other applications that you're talking about can already use Nephio kind of models and principles.
Okay.
Like, it's not a problem. The real problem is where we have a very non-cloud native application. How do we solve that problem? That is basically what the Nephio is targeting.
Basically, I think part of my question, and by the way, I know all of you are more technical and smarter than I am. It's just that we're not bifurcating, we're sort of adding on for the complexity of the telecom environment, but say an AI application that already leverages the, as you said, the magic of, vanilla Kubernetes to run in a Nephio enabled and empowered environment. They don't have to do anything else. They can run on a Nephio empowered, environment in the same way that they can run in any other Kubernetes environment anywhere
Correct.
else in the world.
Correct.
We are adding on the specifics. Okay. I mean, I sort of asked some of this a little bit when Nephio came and presented, sort of last DNTF. And I think everyone was still working through the first release, but that design principle to me is incredibly powerful and incredibly, amazing. And the fact that, people like you and the entire Nephio community is doing that, I think is extraordinary. So I guess you answered my question well done. Not that you needed my approval, but I think for me, that has been a bit of a lingering question of, are we sometimes as a telecom industry, we solve our problems and we go into special snowflake mode, right? Like we think we're treating our resources as cattle, but we start naming them and calling them Daisy and Maybell. And then all of a sudden they've accidentally become pets, And so I guess we are remaining in cattle realm with, special cattle, I guess, maybe that we might need. Sorry, it's still a little bit early morning. I've been up since 4 a.m. My analogies.
Heather, that's the goal. I think that's the goal. To get away from the pet situation, and the whole industry is actually focusing on that aspect, which you mentioned. We should not fall back into that trap.
Exactly.
Maybe
I've been here. I mean, I've been doing this for a number of years, and I've watched us accidentally fall back, as you said, into that crap. And it seems as though we're doing a better job now, which makes me quite happy.
Hey,
Right.
we have 5 minutes. Thank you
for interrupting to ask a question, but it was a question that I felt a little bit needed asking.
Thank you, Heather. That was a very good question.
Maybe if you want to look at it technically, right? There's a Nephio control plane which builds on Kubernetes control plane. Other applications that coexist can leverage the Kubernetes native control plane, while Nephio control plane could coexist, right? That's more of a technology way of looking at it. But then hopefully you get the point. We have got 4 minutes remaining, so I would. This was the last slide.
Keep going through your deck. So, I mean, once again, sorry for interrupting, but I think. Anyway, I'm not going to justify myself. Thank you for entertaining my question, and yes, please go on through the rest of your deck.
In fact, that was really the last question. The last couple slides were just providing additional links. So really look forward to more questions and comments and creative inputs from the community. From this group is what I mean.
All right, come on, y'all. I can't be the only person to ask a question. On an informative and also provocative presentation. Someone else chime in.
So this is Rani. Hi, thanks for the presentation. I think it's a kind of a follow-up for a question I asked Wim earlier today. It seemed like one of the goals or North Stars of Nephio, as you call it, is simplifying the deployment and design of network function and network services. And looking at Wim's demonstration earlier, I felt a little bit intimidated by the level of complexity. So my question is, beyond R1, how are you planning to make this technology more accessible to all these network deployers, network designers, and what are your plans immediately after R1 to work on making it accessible and simple to use?
I can take that, and Sana, you should add. Like accessible can mean many things. First of all, this is all in Git repo that is open to everyone. So it is, in a way, we expect organizations to start building upon it in a way that benefits each of the organizations and hence Nephio. That's point number one. Like I said, in terms of user experience, not just UI, but overall user experience of how different personas in a telco are going to use Nephio for day 0, 1, 2. We are starting to put together these user journeys, layering from the requirements that are coming from the telcos to figure out how do we take what we have built and convert that into an end-to-end user story that a customer persona could take and deploy. And deploy here doesn't mean in a real production network, but even in a lab scenario, we want to be able to exercise an end-to-end call flow. So those are the two areas where we're looking at, ensuring that we don't just develop a portion of the technology for a portion of the user story, but take an end-to-end story as is realizable in a telco environment.
Yeah, thanks. I think I kind of meant making the technology accessible to the end users, meaning and learning from past experience of other projects. If you don't make it simple to like onboard a CNF or deploy a service, then you lose a big chunk of your potential audience or potential install base and users. So I think it's important to invest in making it easy to onboard CNFs and deploy CNFs, and while you're working on the functionality, of course, but
Right,
also
right. Yeah, Rennie, I'll top up a little bit on this. I'm the consumer or the end user of Nephio being in a service provider right now, and we're already looking at ways on how we can consume. Accessibility, number one, Kaushik answered, it's open source, so we can right away get it. But what is coming in open source is the other angle that we need to look at. Thin, lightweight code, not like a huge code that you cannot operationalize and work on or understand. A very lightweight, easy to download code. You can use the Git repositories and you can bring that into your internal repos, and you can work within your internal DevOps teams. Don't need a big operational team to manage the internal first drop of the code that is coming into the community. What is coming into the code is the next question. Generally, in every release, there will be a use case that is actually taking you to the deployment of, for example, one kind of a network function. Say, for example, this is free 5GC this time. Do I need to deploy free 5GC? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe for learning, I will do that. But for other network functions, what the industry has to basically do, or what we can do in parallel, is that you have Helm charts. If you find that learning path from the Nephio's first drop, you can actually write operators and CRDs yourself. This is Kubernetes knowledge. Everybody can take a stab at that and everybody can do that. The second component, which is coming constantly in the open source, which will be evolving into the coming years, are the SDKs and the toolings that helps facilitate the process of writing those operators and CRDs, and our ability to start taking the code into our internal working streams and incorporating that with our own DevOps tooling and pipelines. So the two pieces of the code, one is reusable for all use cases, and the other is basically specific to the use cases. Nonetheless, the code, every time it comes a new drop, there will be a lot of learning and guidance for us to adopt that. But the principles already exist in the Kubernetes world, and there is a lot that we can start to work on in parallel. Basically, is what this community effort is going to take it forward. It's not going to be complex. It's not going to be huge code that we are just looking at and we are not able to operationalize that. I think that is one of the key goals for this community, to make it ready for use for all the end users. And it's a very good question that you asked.
Yeah, thanks. There was a comment by Tyler in the chat that also said that maybe 2 examples would be better than 1. So consider adding something. And also we are over time, and I think people want to move to the next session.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.